Hey everybody, it's Gina here from Gina Makes It. In today's video, I am sharing how I created these sweet little 12 days of Christmas tags that I am preparing to use to document the next 12 days, the 12 days of Christmas, starting with Christmas Day. I normally don't do a December daily. I normally do document the period of time that follows Christmas just because that's when my kids are home on winter break, and that seems to be the most document-worthy type activities that we're doing. So when I came across the sweetest little folk art 12 Days of Christmas bundle in the members only portion of the Graphics Fairy website, I knew that I had to use it. And this was actually a couple months ago. So I had this idea sort of simmering around in my head for a couple months. I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, but I remembered that I had this vintage quilt that was kind of beat up. You could see it to the left there, and it had all of the same colors inside of it that this folk art prints had. And so I knew that I had to use them together somehow, but I wasn't quite sure like what that was going to look like. So I started thinking about it, and I started cutting out pieces of the quilt, and I decided to use the quilt on the back side of a just regular tag that you can get from your craft store, and use the number on the front portion and do some journaling on the back. So you can see I created like a little tuck spot with some vintage lace at the bottom of the tag, and I lined the back of each number with some vintage drawing paper that I had in my stash. If you go to estate sales, you could always get this really cheap for like 25 cents a pad, and it's nice and yellowed around the edges. So I thought that would be a nice addition to the back side of these numbers to do some journaling on. First thing I did was print out all of the number images on some photo mat paper. I wanted a really bright image to kind of match the mood of the quilt and the essence of the drawing themselves, and so that's why I chose to use the photo mat paper. And I also decided to use just some stock tags that I had in my stash, and I probably got these from Tuesday Morning a while ago, and I just thought it would be easiest to use them as the base. So I glued them onto a snippet of vintage quilt, and this is what the quilt looked like before I started cutting it apart. So you can see there were parts that were green and red, and there were parts that are blue and yellow, all sorts of different pieces of the quilt I started to use. And once I glued it down, I just used some regular fabric tack glue. I decided to cut out the tags right along the edge, and so I took my scissors along the perimeter and I cut out each tag. Once I finished doing this, and note I did use my very good sewing scissors because that vintage quilt, if you ever use a vintage quilt to cut apart, is kind of hard with that batting because it's kind of smashed down, so you do need a good pair of scissors. So I used my Crop-A-Dile to just pop a little hole at the top where that existing hole was with the original tag, and because I'm cutting through a whole bunch of layers with fabric too, sometimes I had to take my scissors and pull off a little piece of spare fabric that was hanging on the edge. I decided to use two different types of twine for the top. I used a much thicker one for the actual topper, and that's what gave such a nice fluffy top when all of them are put together. So I just measured a couple inches up at the top, and then I used a much thinner one to tie around the two so they would stand up nice and straight. And I also like the way that that thinner twine kind of hung at the bottom of each tag. Once I finished with that portion of the tag, I flipped them over and I added some vintage lace to the bottom to create sort of a tuck spot for those numbers. Now, I mentioned earlier that I wasn't really sure how I was going to treat the numbers once I was finished journaling on them. I'm not sure if I'm going to attach them somehow to the tag, if I'm going to line the tag with something. I do have a few ideas in my head about using some Christmas music, some vintage Christmas sheet music on the backs. But until I know the extent of how I'm going to use this, and by extent I mean, am I going to be including a picture? Is it just going to be journaling? What exactly am I going to be putting in here? I can't really make any final decisions, because I find when I make those sort of finalized decisions, it makes it so much harder for me when I'm actually sitting down to use the item that I've created. So I've just left it open so I can make those decisions later. So I am just putting a placeholder inside of this lace because I do not want the lace to be glued down to the tag itself. I want to create a little area where I can tuck those numbers in for right now. So I let that dry, and then I pull them out once they are dry, and I move on to my numbers. So basically all I'm doing here is lining the backs with some vintage drawing paper. And I'm doing that because I know that I want to do my journaling on the back, or have the ability to do my journaling on the back. Even if I end up not journaling on the back and I use the tag somehow for my journaling, they'll still have a nice clean color on the back versus just the flip side of that matte photo paper, which isn't really anything. It's not even really a color. You can kind of see through it. So I just glued it down with some Fabri-Tac glue, and I am trimming around the edges in the same exact fashion that I did with the tags and the vintage quilt. Now I am ready to stick my numbers inside of those tags that I just made. And so I take my 4 and my 2, and I look at the back of the tag to see what sort of colors. You can see they all go very, very well, but I was being extra picky, and I was trying to choose one that coordinated even better than the other, if that was possible. And I'm just adjusting the lace so my number sticks in nice and securely for the time being. And now I'm going to open up my little tag holder and add the number 2 and the number 4 to the lineup. Another thing that I was thinking of doing is maybe adding the date to the bottom lace portion. So on this little tag holder that I quickly whipped up, I just added the same lace that I used on the tag itself because I like the way those little scallops were kind of peeking out of the top. So right there I was thinking of maybe adding the date, or maybe on top of the tag. I wasn't sure, but I do know that a date is going to be an important part of this tag configuration. So I decided to store it just tied up with some little twine, like a little package, ready to be opened on Christmas Day and ready to be worked in for the next 12 days. As always, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.